In this, the fears might not change, but over time, the category we put them into can change. Like my spiders, they went from being in the first avoidance category to being in the second out of my comfort zone symbol category.
On Stories of Self, we go on journeys into the lives of ourselves and others. We see how stories connect, how they diverge, and how we can create our worlds and solve our problems. This is the real-life remix of storytelling, which is so often stranger than fiction. So come and sit around the fire, chill by the ocean, or get a coffee with me, as I delve into the stories of self that make, break, and remake us. Some stories are dramatic, some are serene, some will magically mirror you, and some will be delightfully different. I'm your host, Katie Reeve-Arnold, and this is Stories of Self.
Hey, and welcome to the Halloween episode of Stories of Self. This isn't going to be too frightening in some ways, but in other ways, I guess it can be quite terrifying as well. Maybe reality can be more scary than fiction sometimes. Today, I thought we'd spend some time looking at fear. So last time on Stories of Self, we talked about the two fears that we're all born with. The only two fears. That means that all other fears are developed, gathered, accrued since birth for all of us. And we talked about why that is and how we all live slightly different lives, building different fears through the filter of our own unique perspective and experiences. Sometimes some fears can overlap. They can be shared fears developed from the same or different circumstances. Sometimes our fears can be very, very different, to the point where others might not even understand them, and they might even appear wildly funny things to be afraid of to some people. So I'm terrified of something, and that something I'm terrified of is mayonnaise. I'm absolutely terrified. It's my biggest fear. I completely hate it. In fact, this actually can be more common than you would think. At first, it might sound, if you don't have a fear of mayonnaise, it might sound like a really wild and crazy thing to be afraid of. But apparently it is more common than I guess I would have thought. And I've actually, as I've gone through life, encountered a few other people with the exact same fear of mayonnaise. But it's a difficult one for many people to understand. And in fact, I remember a time where some friends had thought they could improve another friend's fear of mayonnaise just by showing him he was okay to have contact with it. So they jumped on him and tried to put some on his hands a bit so that he could see that it was going to be okay. And he called out to me to help him because he knew I was afraid of mayonnaise too. He called out to me to help him and to get them to stop. But I had run away and I was hiding behind a post a little way away, and I really couldn't even help him because the fear I felt was so overwhelming, way too overwhelming to go any closer to the situation. So sometimes our fears can change over time. We can grow and connect with them differently, and this changes the experience pool we're relating the fears to. This is where we get the concept of exposure therapy from. Although, I should point out, it should always be done with a willing participant for it to work. Nobody should be pinned down or made to be exposed to anything they don't want. I kind of created some spider exposure therapy for myself in the rainforests of Sulawesi, Indonesia. I'd gone there to do my thesis for my undergraduate degree. I'd worked hard for months. I'd scrimped and I'd saved to make my dream possible. Yet, I had, probably deliberately, overlooked that working with butterflies in the rainforest would also involve lots of other creepy crawlies too, including a lot of spiders of all shapes and sizes and colours and types. And very quickly I realised I couldn't keep away from them or keep them away from me. Well, that was going to be my sole focus for the 4 months that I was there, because it would take all my time just to look for and move away from the spiders. And then one morning, not long after I arrived, it was on a trek to acclimatise to working and living in camps in the depths of the pristine rainforest. I got out of bed. My bed at that time was a hammock, which I carried during the day, and then I strung between two trees with tiger balm wrapped over the ropes to try and deflect those marching processions of ants that wound their way around the tree trunks. Anyway, I got out of my bed one morning, feeling calm and rested and excited to be there with the sounds of the forest and the wildlife and this luscious green vegetation all around me. And I was living my dream. I was standing in my dream. I got out of bed into my dream. And out of my hammock bed after me came several large spiders of a range of different species and types, and my mouth just dropped open in shock. But I had actually slept well, and nothing had happened to me, and I'd been snuggled up in my hammock bed with all those spiders, and everything was fine. So in that moment, that accidental exposure therapy really worked for me. And while I wouldn't be going holding random spiders for fun, as some of them can leave a nasty bite in the tropics after all, I wasn't going to be running away from them anymore. My experience of spiders had changed, so my perspective had changed accordingly, and my fear had changed, or gone, really. This was a fear I had faced and overcome, because in gaining more experience in relation to it, my perspective had changed. I hadn't had the full story when the fear was formed. And this is really, really common. Fears are fixed into our system early in life, before we have a lot of experience. Then, because we are afraid, we avoid contact with the thing we're afraid of, meaning that the process of gaining additional information is actually hampered by our fear. And a reframe is rendered impossible by our avoidance of the thing that we're afraid of. Fear has its uses, though. We tend to be afraid of things that, in our experience, can hurt us, we think can hurt us, or we don't know what to do with. A few weeks ago, I went to a poetry co-writing group where the prompt was fear. And an interesting discussion came up around the types of fear we see and how we react to or categorize our fears, because we decided there are two different ways of looking at our fears. We can look at fears as something to avoid if possible, and in the end, something to either face and overcome or carry with us for life. Or we can look at fears as something we welcome because it means we are stepping out of our comfort zone. This kind of fear marks leaving the status quo and certainty behind us and stepping into the unknown and all the growth that comes with that. In this, the fears might not change, but over time, the category we put them into can change. Like my spiders, they went from being in the first avoidance category to being in the second out of my comfort zone symbol category. Even something like being scared to walk through a forest at night can go from avoidance to growth. Not in the fact that we should necessarily do it, though. I'm not advocating for putting yourself in unnecessary risk or danger. But in the fact that we can recognize that we've grown to the point where we can give ourselves the assurance that we won't ask this of ourselves. We will provide ourselves with a life where we won't need to be faced with this fear, which originated at some point, for some, at the time, real reason. If we do have this fear, they always come from a real purpose and a real reason at the time. We can note that we are grown now into someone we can trust not to leave ourselves in a position where we are faced with these kinds of fears. We can move from avoidance to self-trust that we won't leave ourselves in that position. The same could be said of the fear of spiders. Not everyone wants or needs to get over that fear. Perhaps some people would rather notice their growth in relation to that fear, by trusting themselves that they will provide a largely spider-free home and holidays in places that are not tropical rainforests or places where spiders are ubiquitous. It's all just personal choice. But it is all moving from avoidance of something we fear and don't understand to informed, reasoned choice in relation to what we want. And in making those choices, we can see that we are no longer being held captive by our fears, because we make the choices in relation to them, and we can make different choices for ourselves at any time. And we can trust ourselves to do that. So if you hate spiders but always fancied a jungle trek, you can change your plan to stay away from spiders and go on your trek in trust that you have made that decision and you are supporting yourself through it. If we're afraid of the woods at night, but we want to go and look at the moonlight glittering off the lake through the woods, we can trust ourselves to discern if this is safe and to make a good choice, to bring company or safeguard measures so we can actually do this safely. A lot of our fears are actually a lack of self-trust. But this makes sense because they often come from childhood, where we didn't have a choice in relation to them or know what to do about them. But whatever your fear is, try trusting yourself to make good choices for yourself in relation to it now. And feel how, when you recognize that you can stand behind yourself, honor your fears, and make choices about them that are in your best interests. And then you actually do act on all those promises to yourself without abandoning yourself or making yourself stupid or wrong, no matter how wild the fear is. When you do all that, those fears start to dissolve from life. They start to get smaller as your self-trust gets bigger. Who knows? This might even be the year where I try my biggest fear. Homemade, though, not store-bought, because I trust myself to make it myself. I might try mayonnaise. Happy Halloween! Let your self-trust dissolve your fears and make the fear of stepping out of your comfort zone a challenge you can embrace with discernment as expansion, if and when you want to. Our fears can keep us distanced and keep us disconnected. But when we lose that connection, we actually find that sometimes we can start to become that which we most fear. But that's another story of self for another day. Take care.
We are all telling our stories, and we are all telling ourselves stories about it all. Are you brave enough to walk with me into hearing, considering, and understanding the stories we tell? Join me next time, where we'll be considering more stories and illusions and stepping into creating the freedom we desire. Every moment, we are who we are choosing to be. You choose. Choose you, because your story matters.